Hello, hello, hello. Okay, cool. Well, it's about time to get started. I hate to break up all the wonderful fellowship, but so we've been practicing this, and the slide on the screen says lesson 9. It's actually 10. You know, I just didn't get that fixed, so my apologies for misnumbering the opening slide, but it's 10. You've been studying with me for 10 weeks. I'm deeply apologetic for that. But it is week 10, and we will be looking today at the trials. And so before we launch into that, we'll practice this for 10 weeks. Let's try it. Good morning. Good morning. Outstanding. It's lovely to see you all here today. Before we launch into this, let's say a prayer, if you would. Our most holy and righteous Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity that we have to come together as your people, as your body, Father. We thank you for the opportunity we have to study your word, to study your Son, to understand what he would have for us in our lives and how he would have us live. Father, we ask you to be with us as we study this time. Help us to glean knowledge from it and apply it to our lives and our walk with him. We ask all these things in your Son's name. Amen. So last week we looked at the garden and the betrayal and arrest of Jesus, and this week we're going to be looking at the trials of Jesus, both, as long as time permits, both the Jewish and the Roman trials. And I want you to understand that today as we study these, we use the term trial very loosely. Primarily because all of these trials are a travesty of what we would consider justice. They're not even remotely an attempt to arrive at guilt or innocence. The condemnation has already been decided. Remember, Caiaphas is the same man who said it's better for one man to die than the nation in speaking about Jesus after the resurrection of Lazarus. So Caiaphas has already made up his mind. And as we go through, I will point out several times, several occasions, several things in the scriptures where it is a clear violation of rabbinical law for the Sanhedrin on this trial. Just the way they did things in general. Several things they did were just wrong. So as we begin, we'll start with the first thing that happens, which is John 18, 12 through 14, and 19 through 23, where Jesus is examined by Annas. Then the detachment of soldiers and its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good for one man to die for the people. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in the synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews came together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now this first portion of the Jewish trials is an examination by Annas. Now Annas had been the high priest from 6 AD until 15 AD. And he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the current high priest. So if you remember, we talked a little bit about this before. Annas had become the high priest in 6 AD and had been that for till 15 AD. And then he bought the office, essentially, from the Romans for his children. And so he'd gone through his sons. Now he's at his son-in-law, who is Caiaphas. All right. Now, from the Jewish perspective, if you look at the law of Moses, the high priest was in office for life. So from a Jewish perspective, Caiaphas had been high priest, he would still be deferred to as the high priest. Annas had been the high priest and was still alive, so in theory he would be the high priest, but the office had been taken away and given to another by the Romans. So even though the Bible talks about Annas being the high priest and Caiaphas being the high priest, it's not a contradiction. Annas had been the high priest and was still alive. Therefore, from a Jewish perspective, he's the high priest. Caiaphas, his son-in-law, now holds the office officially, so he's the high priest. It's not a contradiction. Just understand that there's some stuff going on here. Now, Annas had been deposed by the Roman procurator, a man named Valerius Gratus, and so people viewed him as the rightful high priest. Now, whether they took Jesus to Annas as an act of deference, or whether he had expressed some interest, or perhaps he wanted to question him, we don't really know. But what we do know is Jesus goes first to Annas, which is a violation of law. He would not go to any individual person for trial, especially if they're wanting to put him to death, which is a capital offense, right? Capital trial. He would not go to an individual. He would go to the full court. So they're already breaking precedent. In this exchange, Jesus points out that he's openly taught, so why are you asking me what you've heard? Now, this seems to us, I don't know how we view this. I don't know if you view this as him being just honest or smart alecky, or I'm not really sure how we view it when you read that. But there's a point why he says this. Under Jewish law, you cannot convict someone unless two or more agree on testimony of the violation of the law. Right? Two or more witnesses. Now that's really important because under Jewish rabbinical law, you could admit something to the court blatantly and you still couldn't be found guilty because I can't take your testimony. You cannot incriminate yourself. So Jesus knows the law. So he merely says, why are you asking me? It's a violation, again, of rabbinical law. It doesn't matter what he says. You can't convict him on what he says. And so he just points out, why are you asking me? Now look at the response that he gets. The official that's standing there does what? Strikes him, right? Because somehow he's offended the high priest. Again, what is this? A violation of law. You could not abuse a prisoner at trial. So already they're showing a great level of disdain for the law simply to accomplish their goal. Now, we're going to, at this point, we're going to be bouncing back and forth in the scriptures that we read and what's happening because depending on which gospel you read, and I've tried to lay it out in a reasonable fashion. You don't have to lay it out this way, so kind of do what you want. But we're going to be bouncing back and forth between what's happening with the trial in front of Caiaphas and what's happening in the courtyard with Peter. Because they're happening at the same time. Okay? So just understand that we'll look at the trial piece, and then all of a sudden we'll bounce over to Peter, then we'll bounce back to the trial piece. I'll try not to be too confusing, but it's happening at the same time. And so with this, they send him to Caiaphas. And this is Matthew 26, 57, 59 through 68, Mark 14, 53, 55 through 65, Luke 22, 54, and then 63 through 65, and John 18, 24. It says, and they took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and elders and the teachers of the law came together. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Now at this stage, Jesus is brought before Caiaphas and some portion of the Sanhedrin that had been brought together during a night session to find some basis on which they could condemn Jesus. Now, it's probably likely that there were a quorum, right? Remember, there's 71 members of the Sanhedrin, so they have to have a certain percentage of them there to come to a decision, but they're not all there yet. Okay? Now, the interesting part is, it tells us why they came together. They came together to do what? To judge his guilt or innocence? To give him a fair trial? No. They came together because they're looking for evidence to put him to death. It is a predetermined course of action that they're taking. There's no question in their mind where they're going to end up. Does that sound like justice? And so there's probably a quorum or something. Now, the other thing that's interesting is they come together when? This is probably around midnight. Jewish rabbinical tradition says you cannot have a capital trial at night, period. Must be done during the day. So again, they're violating their own law to do what they want to do. So they've got him there. They're asking him. They're trying to find witnesses. They're soliciting liars. And the problem is that the liars aren't even agreeing. And remember, you've got to have what? 2 or more witnesses that agree. Then they can't find that yet. So upon Jesus' arrest, remember the disciples had fled. However, as Jesus is led away, Peter and John follow him and his captors at some distance until they reach the high priest's house. Now, there's an indication here that John was known personally either by the high priest or by the high priest's household. Because when we read this next section, John goes in. He's recognized and they let him in. And then he turns around and obtains entrance for Peter. Right now, interestingly enough, as we read this, this is the last we hear of John. Now, it may be that because of the course of events that we see with Peter, John thought it was appropriate to make haste out of there and not stick around. Or John may have stuck around and was there the whole time. We don't know. He's not really mentioned. Okay? So it's not talked about in either the third person or he's done anything other than what we're about to see. And so we'll start there. And this is Matthew 26, 58, 69 through 75, Mark 14, 54, 66 through 72, Luke 22, 54 through 62, and John 18, 15 through 18, and then 25 through 27. It says, and Simon Peter followed Jesus at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest and entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. So was another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, are you not also one of this man's disciples? And he said, I am not. Now the first denial doesn't take very long. Right? They're following at a distance. They get to Caiaphas' house. John is allowed in. Peter's outside. John gets access for Peter. And as he's going in, the girl who's charged with keeping the door sees Peter, who John just asked her to let in. She apparently knows John. Right? So as Peter walks in, she says, what? Are you one of his disciples too? And Peter's immediate response is what? Nope, not me. Now, it may have just been the question answer was an impetus at this point for John to say, yeah, I'm out. This is going to get uncomfortable. Or it may be just it was just a slight conversation and they went on in. But either way, we know that Peter is asked and immediately denies that he is a disciple. Now it's interesting, his first denial is what? I'm not his disciple. It's that simple. Okay? Now, then we go back to the trial and the questioning. It says, and finally 2 came forward, stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with hands. And declared, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Yet even their testimony did not agree. And the high priest stood up before them and said to Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent. Now, again, the Sanhedrin is soliciting liars to come forward, and they get 2 guys that come close to the same story, but we're given both sides of the statement. One apparently says, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with hands, while the other said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Now, the problem is the liars can't get their story straight, and ultimately, They kind of align regarding something Jesus said, but if you go back and look at what Jesus said, he's responding to a question, and he says, destroy this temple. And the Bible tells us he was referring to his body. This is from John 2, right? And in 3 days I will raise it up. He's not talking about the temple in Jerusalem. He's talking about his body, right? So both guys are coming up with lies. They're distorting what he said. We don't know if they actually heard it secondhand, if they're just making it up. But even their testimony doesn't agree. And remember, they have to have two that agree. And so now they're trying to push him to get him to say something in response to this. And remember, one of the rights of an accused in Jewish rabbinical law is A, you can't convict on his own testimony, and B, he doesn't have to incriminate himself. So Jesus just remains silent. They've not brought anything forward that would be probable cause or anything wrong so far. Now we go back outside. Now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold. And they were warming themselves, and Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. And as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servants' girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter as he sat in the firelight and looking intently at him, she looked at him warming himself and said, this man was with him too. You also were with Nazarene Jesus. But he denied it with an oath, saying, woman, I do not know him. I neither know or understand what you are talking about. And he went out into the entryway. Now, moving back into the courtyard, Peter has been asked when he walked in. Now he's standing by the fire alternately, depending on which gospel you're reading. It says standing or sitting. So it's a cold night. They've got a fire. He's standing by the fire. He's sitting by the fire. He's staying close to the fire. And the girl who kept the door, or another servant, comes up and sees him and looks at him intently. And you were with him too. This guy's one of them also. So then he's asked. And this time, he doesn't deny that he's a disciple. He does what? He denies that he even knows him. I don't even know what you're talking about. I don't know this guy. With an oath, he swears that he doesn't know Jesus. Now, at that point, he's feeling a little uncomfortable because people are recognizing him for whatever reason. So now he moves away from the fire. Now we go back inside. And again, the high priest asked him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, the Son of God? You have said so, replied Jesus. I am. But I say to you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him as worthy of death. The men who were regarding Jesus began mocking and beating him, and some began to spit at him, and the guards took him and blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, prophesy, who hit you? And they said many other insulting things to him. So at this point in the trial, Caiaphas really doesn't have a whole lot of hope in getting two witnesses to lie, the same lie to entrap Jesus. So Caiaphas kind of pivots and uses, I would say, an act of desperation, trying to get something on Jesus, and he adjures Jesus under oath. When a common oath at this time was, I adjure you by the living God, which is basically what Caiaphas said. And that's like a standard Jewish formula for putting a person under oath. Much like if you went to court and they had you swear on a Bible, the testimony you're about to receive, same kind of thing. Right? So he's asking Jesus, he puts him under formal oath to say, are you or are you not the Messiah? Now, interestingly enough, Jesus' answer, he says, and it might sound confusing to us, it's idiomatic way, it's a common way they said yes. He says, you have said yes. But just clear it up, he says yes also. So he says yes. Then he uses his most common term that he uses to refer to himself, the Son of Man. And he makes a statement to Caiaphas, and the statement, the impetus of the statement essentially is this, that while you may be attempting to humiliate me at the moment, in short, very short time, I will be restored to the right hand of the Father. Now, at this point, Caiaphas tears his robes. which is interesting, right? Why are you really upset by a guy that you already think is a blasphemer who just said something you're going to consider, even though it's not technically blasphemy? You're going to consider it blasphemy to get done what you want to do to begin with. So it's part of this. It's part of the imagery we get from the Gospels that lets you know that this is just a travesty of justice. They're not even trying. They're just trying to make it look like it's a proceeding. And so he tears his robe. Now, the other thing that's interesting is that's a violation of rabbinical law. The high priest is not allowed to tear his robes. The high priest was supposed to be, in theory, the representative of Israel to God. He could not tear his robes because that's a sign of deep mourning. Why would the high priest mourn if he's the representative of Israel to God? And so he tears his robes. And it's interesting because there are rabbinical sources that talk about this and justify Caiaphas' action because this was such a bad case. So again, we're just going to toss our own law aside and do what we want. But he does this, he tears his robes, and he's just kind of show his shock. Now, the interesting thing is, blasphemy is when you use the Lord's name in vain or you denigrate the Lord. Did Jesus do either of those things? No. He technically didn't blaspheme. But at this point, they don't care. It's not about that. But he does respond and tell them that, you might be humiliating me now, but the situation is going to be reversed in short order. And then Caiaphas, again, violates law and says, what need do we have of witnesses? Why do we need more witnesses? Again, remember, rabbinical law says I cannot incriminate myself. Even if I admit something, you can't convict me on my testimony. You have to have two witnesses that agree. Doesn't matter what I say. Right? And that's to prevent, I know this is crazy, but that's to prevent people admitting to crimes they didn't do. Like we see that today. Right? And so that was what the purpose of that was. You had to have two people outside of the person who was charged who saw this and admitted and were witnesses to it. You couldn't accept the person's testimony. And so they failed to meet the legal standard, but at this point they just chuck that out the window. They don't care anymore because they're going to call it blasphemy and we're going to convict him. So then we go back outside. A little later, by the bystanders, another man, one of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off, came up and said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" And began to insist, said to Peter, "Surely you two are one of them, for even the way you talk gives you away, for you're also a Galilean." And he began to curse and swear, "I do not know the man you're talking about." And immediately while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word which Jesus had said, "Before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and cried bitterly. By now, Peter's moved away from the fire, and soon multiple people start pointing him out, including someone who was related to the guy whose ear he cut off earlier that night, who Jesus healed. And so then they even tell him, you got to be one of them. You even sound like them. It was interesting because in kind of studying some of this stuff, Galileans had a very distinct dialect from the people who lived in Jerusalem. They had a tendency to slur their words. They pronounced many of the letters alike. And then some letters they just didn't pronounce. So it was very recognizable to hear a Galilean speak. And so they knew he sounded off, "I'm pretty sure I saw you. Aren't you the guy that was there that cut off my relative's ear?" And so at this point, Peter began swearing and calling down curses that he doesn't know anything about what these people are talking about. He doesn't know Jesus at all. And at that moment, the rooster crows, and Jesus, where he's in this trial, turns and locks eyes with Peter. And at that point, Peter realizes what he's done and leaves. And it says he weeps bitterly. Now we're in the final stage of the Jewish trial. And this is Matthew 27, 1 through 2, Mark 15, 1, Luke 22, 60 through 23, 1, and John 18, 28. And it says, "Now when morning came, as the day came, early in the morning, the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, and the whole Sanhedrin immediately held council. Again, Jesus put against Jesus to put him to death. And they led him away to their Sanhedrin, saying, "If you're the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask you a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You yourselves say that I am." Then they said, "What further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard ourselves from his own mouth." Then their whole assembly rose up, and binding Jesus, they led him away to deliver him to Pilate, the governor. Now, after Caiaphas obtained what he felt was a statement incriminating enough to accuse Jesus of blasphemy, he hastily calls the whole Sanhedrin together. Now, he might have had a quorum of people that were already against Jesus, but now he calls, in theory, the whole Sanhedrin together. And they've got two purposes. One is to obtain a formal confirmation of the sentence they've already passed, which is illegal. Right? And then second, to condemn him to death on a charge of blasphemy. The problem is the Jews couldn't kill anyone. The Romans, when they conquered people, they reserved the right to take life themselves. Now, you can punish people, but you can't kill them. We get to do that. And so life and death was a Roman decision. And so the council members agree that they've got to convince Pilate. Now, Pilate's a Roman, right? So the charge they're bringing him on is a religious charge, blasphemy, claiming to be God. Okay, now just think about this for a second. A man, in theory, a man claiming to be God. What are the Romans going to think about that? Hey, we got a bunch of those guys. I think most of them were named Caesar at the time, right? So Pilate didn't care about that, and he's not going to care about that. So they've got to come up with a way to force Pilate to kill Jesus. So they bring Jesus to Pilate's headquarters. Now, he's there for the feast. Most likely, his quarters are somewhere near or in the Fortress Antonia. Now, the Fortress Antonia is located near the temple, but it's outside the temple complex because all the people in the Fortress Antonia are Gentiles, right? So they would, they would be unclean. So this delegation from the Sanhedrin goes, but they're not going to enter the Praetorium proper because they don't want to be ceremonially undefiled and unable to partake of the Passover. Now, an interesting thing at this point is they're worried about becoming ceremonially unclean, right? By going into the Praetorium, because Gentiles are there. No one could be convicted of a capital offense at night. No one could be convicted of a capital offense on a Sabbath. No one could be convicted of a capital offense on a feast day. And they're worried about being ceremonially unclean? I mean, they're pretty dirty right now. And they don't seem to care. So now we move to this Roman trial. And the Roman trial is interesting. So the first stage of the Roman trial, it's Matthew 27, 11 through 14, Mark 15, 2 through 5, Luke 23, 2 through 5, and John 18, 28 through 38. It says, then the whole assembly, rose up and led him, Jesus, from Caiaphas into the Praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter the Praetorium, so they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." So Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." And the Jews said, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, in order that the word of Jesus which he spoke would be fulfilled, signifying what kind of death he was about to die." And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding the paying of taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Therefore Pilate entered into the Praetorium and summoned Jesus. Now, at first, it's interesting, they show up with Jesus. Pilate comes out to him. What's the charge? And if he wasn't an evildoer, we wouldn't have brought him. What's their first attempt? You don't need to know anything about him. Just kill him. He's a bad guy. But that's just, right? And what's Pilate's response? Man, take him away and judge him by your law. That doesn't work because their law won't let them kill him. So they need the Romans to do this. So then they start saying, they give him 3 charges. They start with 3 charges. The 3 charges are misleading our nation. Okay, well, one, that's pretty vague, and I'm not even sure that was a law anywhere. Misleading the nation? How? In what fashion? What does that even mean? Two, forbidding the paying of taxes of Caesar. That's an outright lie. Remember in Matthew 22:17 through 21, Jesus had already said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. All right? And then lastly, claiming to be a king. This also is a misleading statement because while he may have claimed to be a king, he never claimed to be a political king. He never talked about overthrowing the Romans. That was not his position. That wasn't what he was here for. So now, Jesus stands before the governor, and the chief priests began to accuse him of many things, and while he was being accused by the chief priests and the elders, he did not answer. And Pilate questioned him, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, you yourself say it. And the chief priests began to accuse him of many things. And then Pilate said to him, do you not hear how many things they testify against you? And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor marveled greatly. Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium, summoned Jesus, and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered, are you saying this from yourself, or did others tell about me? And Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What did you do? And Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be delivered over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Therefore Pilate said to him, so you are a king? And Jesus answered, you yourself said that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And Pilate said to him, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. But they kept on insisting, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting with Galilee, even as far as this place. Now when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself was also in Jerusalem in those days. So at this point, Pilate sees an out. He's questioned Jesus. Nothing he says is worthy of death under Roman law. So he's like, I don't find any guilt in this guy. And he comes out, and they won't let it go. And so they start talking about, he's taught from Galilee all the way down here. And so he asked Pilate, is he a Galilean? Now, the Galilee had a king, and the king was Herod. Herod happens to be in town, again, for Passover. Now, Herod doesn't care anything about Passover. He's not an observant Jew. He's just trying to make sure the chief priests and everybody's happy with him, so he doesn't want to cause problems. Remember, he's not even Jewish, technically. And so he's in town, so Pilate thinks, okay, well, let's just send him over there. Now, this is found in Luke 23, 8 through 12. It said, now when Herod saw Jesus, he rejoiced greatly, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him, and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there, vehemently accusing him. And Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, and dressed him in a bright robe, and sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they had been at enmity with each other. So Herod's in Jerusalem for Passover. Pilate's hoping maybe he can earn some points, so he sends Herod Jesus. Now the interesting part is Herod's primary interest in Jesus seems to be from a sense of form of entertainment. He doesn't really care about anything about hearing him or hearing what he teaches. He wants to see a miracle. That's it. And not because he wants to believe, he just wants to be entertained. And so Jesus, as we've seen throughout his ministry, isn't necessarily given to performing miracles for people for show. His miracles had a purpose. And in this case, there's no purpose other than to satisfy the curiosity of Herod. So Jesus says nothing and does nothing. And at some point, they make sport of him. They play. They make fun of him, trying to humiliate him. He still doesn't respond. They dress him in a royal robe. This is a sign of contempt. And Herod gets tired of the show. Sends him back to Pilate. So now we come to the second stage of the Roman trial. The scriptures are up there. It says, now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted or whom they requested. And at that time, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. And the man had been imprisoned with insurrectionists who had committed murder in the insurrection. So when the people gathered together, And the crowd went up and began to ask him to do as he'd been accustomed to do for them. And Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers of the people, and Pilate said to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. Behold, I've examined him before you. I have found in this man no guilt of what you are accusing. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us. And behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore, I will punish him and release him. Now he was obliged to release to them at the feast one prisoner. Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ? For he knew that because of envy they had delivered him over. But they cried out all together, saying, away with this man and release for us Barabbas. He had been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city and for murder. Now while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, have nothing to do with that righteous man. For last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded and stirred up the crowds to ask for Barabbas and put Jesus to death. But the governor answered to them, which of the two do you want me to release for you? And they said, Barabbas. And Pilate said to them, then what will be done with Jesus, who is called the Christ? And they all said, let him be crucified. And he said, why? What evil did he do? But they were crying out all the more, saying, let him be crucified. And again Pilate addressed them, wanting to release Jesus, but they kept on calling out, crucify him, crucify him. And he said to them a third time, why? What evil has this man done? I found in him no guilt worthy of death. Therefore I will punish him, release him. But they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified, and their voices were prevailing. Pilate then took Jesus and flogged him. At this moment, Pilate's not making any headway. He's trying to present them a really bad choice. You can have either an insurrectionist and murderer, or you can have this guy who I don't find any guilt in. And the high priest, the chief priests have stirred up the crowd to scream for Barabbas. That's all they want. They just want Jesus crucified. So at this point, the crowd is just going over the top. So Pilate, theoretically in his mind, is thinking, I need to try to find a way out of this. Right, because I don't want to release an insurrectionist, but at the same time, these people are demanding this guy be killed. So I'm going to punish him, and then we'll see what happens. Now, I want you to understand, when he says this, and it says he sent him to be flogged, he's hoping, I think, and I don't know this for sure. I mean, it's just supposition on my part. He's hoping that at some point there will be some modicum of humanity in this crowd. Right? And here's why. That's a Roman scourge. It's got a wooden stick with a leather-wrapped handle, and then it has leather straps coming off it. It could be anywhere up to like 12 different straps. And in the straps, sewn into the straps, are pieces of bone, pieces of glass, lead balls, and hooks. Now, when they scourge somebody, and there's two different ways I've seen this portrayed. They either had a very, very large pillar that they chained his hands and feet to that stretched him around the pillar. Or they used a short boulder to lay him over and strap him to it. And then they would take that instrument with two men alternating on each side, taking their turn lashing. With every lash, the balls would hit, cause contusions, potentially break bones, potentially put out eyes, knock out teeth. They were strapped. The reason they stretched them is because they could beat them from here to the back of their thighs. Now, Jewish tradition says you could scourge people 40 times less one, 39 stripes. Romans didn't have that law. We have no idea how long this went on. But we do know that by the time he's done, he's a bloody mess. Now remember, when we talked about the garden, hydromatosis, the bleeding causes sensitivity to the skin. This is worse than anybody else had ever suffered. And it takes this beating. And then while he's there, it says, when the Romans and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns together, they put it on his head and put a purple robe on him, and they were coming to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." and were giving him slaps in the face. And the people came out again and said to him, Behold, and Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, Behold the man. Pilate's hoping that the severity of the scourging elicits some stop to the insane crowd crying for his death, and it doesn't. So when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. And the Jews answered him, We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he became more afraid, and he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? And Jesus gave no answer. So Pilate said, Do you not speak to me? Do you know that I have the authority to release you, and I have the authority to crucify you? And Jesus said, You would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered to me has the greater sin. And as a result of this, Pilate kept seeking to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, If you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself to be a king opposes Caesar. Now Pilate's has had trouble in the past controlling the Jews, and he has run afoul of Caesar for having killed people and violence. And so he really, at this point, he sees no way out. Now he attempts again to try to satisfy them by showing them Jesus in his abused state. John tells us it's about the 6th hour, using Roman time, which means it's about 6 a.m. in the morning when this occurs. And this is the last section. It says, Therefore, Pilate heard these words. He brought Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, Behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. Now when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was stirring, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourself. And all the people answered and said, His blood be on us and our children. And he released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he delivered him to be crucified. So Pilate now uses a symbolic act to say, I find no guilt in him. I'm washing my hands. I'll turn him over to you. Let him do what you want, but I bear no guilt in this. And Jesus had already told him what? You wouldn't have authority over me if it hadn't been given to you above, but the person who turned me over to you has the greater guilt. Pilate's not free of guilt. He didn't do his job. He condemned an innocent man to death, but at the same time, who's really to blame for this? Caiaphas. This was his plan from the beginning. Now, next week, we'll look at the crucifixion and the burial. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention.
Jesus' love and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest phrase.